Today's video does contain some disturbing content and viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you'd like to send my way, just go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. There was a time in my life when things were really bad. Like, I was homeless and living as a vagabond. Getting food from trash cans, begging people for change kind of bad. This was a long time ago, and I'm doing a lot better in my life now, but this point in my life was really low. And while some may say that I could have been hallucinating or seeing things, I was not a stereotypical hobo. I didn't do any sort of drugs, I didn't drink. I just struggled to get through every day, and what led to me being homeless was out of my control. I'm not going to get into all that because it's not really important. But I will say that I was basically living in a rust bucket with 4 wheels that barely ran. Back when this happened, most cities weren't really bothered by people sleeping in their cars like they seem to be today, and so long as you were out of the way and not bothering anybody, you could pretty much just stay where you were for the night. No one would really care. Back then, because I was sleeping in my car, I typically tried to park it somewhere that was away from people and wouldn't be an issue for anybody. There was one spot that I liked specifically that was in a small suburban area that was only sort of incorporated. It was mostly residential, and there were woods that pretty much surrounded the streets. Like, there were a good number of houses, but if you kept going, there was an area that was just a road with trees on both sides. I would go towards that area that didn't have the houses, and I would pull over and park on the side of the road as close to the trees as I could. And that's where I would essentially camp out. It almost felt like actually camping, to be honest with you, because it was surrounded by the trees, and I was safe in my little car. So I just tried to hold on to that optimism and make the most out of it. That is, until the event this story is about happened. I had been camping there for a couple of weeks, just thankful that I had a bit of stability in my depressing circumstance. On that night, I had actually managed to get a few dollars together, so I had gotten a Big Mac from McDonald's and a small soda. I was honestly happy as could be. It was around 9 p.m., and I was sitting there, savoring my meal, when I noticed what looked like a deer in a small clearing in the woods. I'd seen a few deer in this area before, so it wasn't really surprising, but I also really liked deer, so I was thinking that this was going to be an even better night. When you're in a bad situation, the simple things can mean a lot, honestly. As the deer started walking through the woods and getting closer to where I was, I started to see that there was something wrong with it. At first, I thought that it had some sort of parasite or something. I had read about those kinds of things, but I quickly realized that this was not a parasite. Whatever was wrong with this thing was really wrong. As it got closer, I was able to see that it looked like the skin was actually falling off of its face. Like, I could see part of its jawbone from where its flesh was near literally melting off its face. It took me a minute to really realize what the hell I was seeing. I was trying to mentally piece together that maybe it had been attacked and was dying. But no, the skin wasn't falling off like it had been ripped into. It was melting. And it wasn't just its face. It was all over its head, legs, midsection. Its antlers were sharp-pointed and were also broken, and it looked like they had some kind of skin hanging off of them too. I was thinking that if this was a deer, it was really messed up from something. But after a few moments, I came to be certain that this was not a deer. As it stepped through the woods, This thing got towards a tree and slowly pulled itself up onto its hind legs and started scratching at the tree with its hooves. Though, they weren't really hooves. They almost looked more like claws. This zombified deer monster thing was standing there, its flesh falling off the bone, and clawing at the base of the tree for God knows what reason. I genuinely have no idea what this thing was, but I immediately started my car and drove off. I was not going to deal with whatever the hell this monster was. I had nothing to protect myself or to fight this monster with if it decided it wanted to come and get me, and I was not going to die by some melting deer thing. I wish that I had a camera with me at the time, or that this was when camera phones were a common thing, because I cannot properly explain how disgustingly terrifying this thing really was. And if I'd gotten a picture of it, then maybe I could get someone out there to hunt it and kill it. Because this thing was not natural. If it was a deer, then the only word I can think to describe it is zombified. And the fact that its hooves looked more like claws to me tells me that this thing was something else altogether. Obviously, I never went back to that area, ever. I never camped out there again, and I pretty much kept my car in parking lots when I was still sleeping in it. I thankfully did get through this hard time, and things are better now, but I will never forget the night that I saw that horrifying beast, and I'm just glad that I have never seen anything like it again. I have a really weird and creepy story from when I was a kid, and I really don't know what it was that I saw, but whatever it was not human. On top of that, I want to start this story with what I guess would be a trigger warning. This story is not a happy one. It does not involve a happy ending, but it does involve my childhood dog. If you choose to read this one, this should serve as a warning to your listeners that if they can't stand things happening to dogs, it's recommended that they skip this story. So, the story happened back when I was a kid. I believe that I was around 10 years old at the time, give or take a year. I'm in my 50s now, so it was a subjectively long time ago, to be honest. I'm sorry that I can't remember the exact year that this happened. At this time, I lived with my parents, my big brother, and my pet dog, Aries. Aries was a small dog, smaller than a retriever but bigger than a Shih Tzu. I don't remember what exactly he was, mostly because he was pretty much just a mutt. But he was a good dog, and he was very protective of me and my brother. When I say protective, I mean really protective. When my uncle came over, if he tried to give me or Brian a hug, Aries would bark and try to bite his leg. That was actually why we called him Aries. He was like a little warlord, attacking anything that he didn't want near his family. Now, where we lived wasn't heavily populated, but I can't say that it was completely desolate. Just that there weren't many houses in the area. There were a lot of woods, however, and with the woods come things like coyotes, foxes, and things like that. I'd seen all that in my few years alive, and I knew what they were, how they looked, and what they sounded like when they cried. There were also claims of wolves and wildcats living in the woods near the house too, though I had never seen any of those. This may all sound like I'm just rambling, but I'm trying to show that I knew what all these things were, and if what I saw was one of those, I would have most likely been able to identify it. The first time that I saw this thing was one day when I was outside playing after school. It was the middle of autumn, and the leaves were starting to turn color, and it was starting to get a bit colder. I was out back, swinging a stick, probably pretending that I was a knight and battling for my made-up kingdom, when I heard what sounded like a person crying out behind my yard. This didn't sound like a child. It sounded like an adult was weeping out in the trees. Like they wanted to sob, but they were controlling themselves and holding it all in as best as they could. I remember that this caught me off guard, and my curiosity ended up getting the best of me. I needed to know why there was an adult out in the woods and why they were crying. I went over to the back of the fence, and I looked out into the woods, trying to see if I could find the person that was crying. At first, I couldn't see anything. But after kind of glancing around the trees, I noticed that there was what looked like a man standing out in the woods near one of the trees, and I remember chuckling to myself because he looked like he was naked. Again, I was like 9 or 10, so it was just kind of funny to me that this person was standing naked out in the woods like that. But as I kept staring, something about him felt wrong. He looked like he was too skinny to be alive, really. Like, his skin was the only thing blocking his skeleton from the wind. And as quickly as I thought it was funny, I started feeling a bit scared. It was at this point that Aries started growling and barking at the person, and as soon as he did, this thing turned around to look at me, and I will never forget its face. It was flat, like there was no nose. His eyes were dark black, his mouth looked larger than a normal person's, and it looked like he had fangs, or sharp and really cut teeth. I could see all of this from where I was standing, and he wasn't anywhere near me. And that should tell you how much of an impact that visual had on me. I freaked out. I immediately ran back to the house. Aries was following me, but he was also stopping and barking at the back of the yard every few steps. But after a few moments, he ran with me back to the house. I had no idea what to really do with this event, so I just kind of sat in my room and had what I now know to be a panic attack. This thing was terrifying. It looked human, but it definitely wasn't. And it wasn't any of the aforementioned creatures. I remember my brother coming into my room and asking if I was okay, because he said he could hear me crying from his room. Which was a surprise to me, because I wasn't even aware that I was actually crying. I told him that I saw something in the woods that scared me, and when I tried to explain what it was, he said that it sounded weird, but that it probably wasn't a big deal, and that it was just a sick animal or something. He was older than me, so I assumed he was probably right, but deep down, I knew that that was wrong. Now, if that was the only time that I ever saw this thing, it would have been one too many times. But it wasn't. And the next time that I saw it was where things got worse. I want to add again that this second time is the disturbing event that I mentioned earlier, and this is your fair warning that things did not end well. The second time that I saw it was about a week later. I was out back again, just sitting on my slide and staring out into the woods. After I saw that thing, I was actually scared to do much outside, but my parents were the type to tell me to go play outside all the time, so I would pretty much just sit there and stare out into the woods, seeing if this thing would come back. And unfortunately, it did. This time it was a lot closer. I was watching the trees and I noticed that this thing was standing out in the woods, basically just crawling on its knuckles. This time, in a moment of stupidity and bravery, I actually shouted at it, telling it to go away. I don't know if I thought that this thing would understand me or what, but that's what I did. When I shouted, this thing turned to face me, and it started to do its weird crawl, walk motion in my direction towards the fence. Unfortunately, this was enough for Aries to freak out. He actually ran towards the fence and dug out the small spot in the corner and went under the fence out into the woods. barking aggressively and chasing this thing. The creature did start to run, I guess further into the woods, but Aries was unrelenting, and he kept chasing him. I started shouting for him, but he completely ignored me. I ran back to the house, and I shouted for my dad, saying that Aries got out and was chasing something into the woods. I wanted to tell him that it was some kind of monster, some human-like beast, but the only word I could get out of my mind was something. I won't bore you with the conversation and how we went out to call for him beyond saying that my dad jumped the fence and went out into the woods looking for him while I stayed at the fence. After a while, he told me to go inside and get my mom, and to stay inside until they came back, which I did. I later found out that the reason he told me to get my mom and stay inside was because he did find Aries. But what he found wasn't pleasant. They both explained to me that Aries was unfortunately gone, and they then had to explain that things like this happen sometimes in nature. I tried to describe what the thing was that I saw, but they basically told me that it was likely something like a wolf that had gotten to him. I was insistent, but they just dismissed me and told me that they would bury him out in the woods and that it would be okay. Obviously, I was devastated. Aries was a good boy. He just wanted to protect me, and whatever the hell this monster was had killed him. That was actually the last time that I saw this thing, and unfortunately my family just accepts that it was probably a wolf or something, and Aries just wasn't big enough to hold his own. But I know that's wrong. I know that this thing was some sort of humanoid monster, not a wolf. I hate that this whole thing was probably my fault. If I hadn't shouted at it, it probably wouldn't have started approaching, and Aries probably wouldn't have gone after it. But I can't blame myself. Aries was trying to protect me from this thing, and he did his job, as it never did come back. I will always love and honor that pup as being the guardian that he was, and I will never forget what that thing was that I saw. That horrifying face and the disgusting frame that this thing had as it slowly approached me that day. This was about a year ago. For a while before I started taking melatonin, I had always had lots of trouble sleeping. Many nights I would stay up until 3 a.m. or so, and whenever I stayed up past midnight, I felt very weird. I always passed this weird feeling of dread as my generalized anxiety disorder, which I have lots of problems with. I still get this feeling sometimes randomly during the day, too. A note before I get into the next part: I have a leopard gecko in my room, so there's always a bit of light coming from her tank. So, one night around 2:30 a.m., I still couldn't sleep. I rolled over as I do a lot when I can't sleep, but something was off. It took me a second to realize, but it was brighter in my room than normal. For this next part, let me go over some stuff about my house. My room used to be a porch, so it's almost entirely windows. And if I were to roll over, I would face my backyard. We have a wooden deck, and it covers most of the yard, except for most of the parts that I can see from my window. Anyways, it took a few seconds, but I realized that the backyard motion sensor light was on. And it confused me since usually stuff that would pass by doesn't set it off. It hasn't been set off in the middle of the night before or since. I got up, wide awake, and I looked out the window. There, I saw some really weird creature. It kind of crawled like a cat, but way too fast crawling to be a cat. It was too big to be a raccoon or groundhog or something similar, though it was brown. It had no tail or ears, but it looked like it had very thin fur. Again, too big to be some kind of rodent. I had a good comparison for size of a nearby lawnmower. It was unnaturally fast, and it crawled unnaturally too. I could tell it was crawling because I could see defined shoulders, and it was very low to the ground. This thing was again the size of my dog's, so about 3 feet tall if it were to stand up fully, and 2 feet long. It darted across my yard behind the deck where I could no longer see it. I stared for a while, but I never saw it come from anywhere. If it were to come back from behind the deck, I would be able to see it if I tried, which I was. It took half a second to move a solid 20 feet, and keep in mind that it was crawling. My best guess is maybe it was some weird crawling coyote, since there are some in the area. There was no way that this was a dream though, because I remember checking my phone for the time when I eventually went back to bed, and I couldn't fall asleep for another hour. Plus, I don't really get nightmares. Another thing, it was not one of my dogs. I have no solid brown dog, and none of my neighbors do either. Though, I don't think it was a dog since it was crawling way too fast to be a dog, and it had no tail or ears. This may be related, but a while before this happened, I heard some kind of weird canine howling, and I even recorded it. I could hear it in the video, but everybody that I knew never heard this thing. This was happening for 2 solid days. I even showed them the video and they couldn't hear it. I felt like I was going insane because I could never find anything in the area that would howl like the howl that I heard, and it freaked me out. I used to spend a lot of my summer vacation at my grandparents' house, which was essentially a small farm in the middle of nowhere. And as much as I loved my grandparents, I used to also get really bored. I used to go out and explore some of their land, and would oftentimes go out into the forest that lined their property, despite the fact that my grandma would tell me that I needed to stay close to the house. One year, I had ventured out and found what was basically a small cave near the property line, and I loved it. It was a really small cave, like large enough to fit me comfortably in it when I was about 10, and that was about it. It was large enough for an adult to kind of crawl into, but it would be rather cramped and it would not be comfortable for anyone larger than a child to stay in for more than just a few minutes. I had actually painted one of the walls with my name and some other random things, just to pretty much mark it as mine. It was dumb, but it was my little home away from my grandparents' farmhouse. As I got into my older teenage years, I stopped going to my grandparents' house as frequently, mostly because my parents were more okay with me staying home alone. I hadn't been to the farmhouse for a few years by the time this all happened, as a matter of fact. About a decade ago, my grandfather passed away. So, I actually spent several days with my grandmother at the house to try to keep her company, and to make sure that she was doing okay. On one of the days while I was staying with her, I wanted to walk the property line and make sure things were okay, and after a little while, I remembered my little cave. I wanted to go see if it was still there, or if it had been taken over by nature. I headed out to the northern corner of the land, jumped the fence, and headed out into the woods, right towards where the cave was. After a few moments of fumbling with the location, I actually found where the opening was, and was excited to see that it was still there. The next part was the difficult part, which was me trying to figure out if I could even get into the cave at all without getting stuck. After thinking it through, I decided that I could pretty much get half of my body in if I turned the right way, and from there, I should be able to see if my name was still painted on the wall. I get down on the ground and I start to twist myself in, and as soon as I get my head into the cave, I start to smell something putrid. It was pretty obvious that something had died there, which was disappointing, but I just assumed that it would be a possum or a raccoon or something that had scurried away to die inside the cave. It was gross, but it wasn't going to stop me from seeing if this was still my cave. I get my head in, and what I saw was horrifying. It wasn't just a small dead animal. It was numerous dead animals. Like dozens of carcasses were lined up on the back wall. There was also what looked like children's clothing piled off to the side, and what looked like an old doll sitting on top of the clothes. At this point, I was out. I pushed myself out of the cave, not even caring if it was still marked, because something was staying in that cave, and I didn't want to know what the hell it was. As most scary stories go, though, it didn't just end with dead animals in the cave. As soon as I pushed myself out, I started hearing what sounded like growling or hissing. I stood up and looked around, but I didn't see whatever it was that was so angry with me until I looked up. I have no idea what the hell this thing was, but it was about 200 feet away from me, standing in one of the trees and angrily growling at me. It looked human-like, but it 100% was not human. I took off, thinking this creature was definitely going to chase me, but about halfway to the fence, I looked back and saw that this thing was actually crawling on the ground toward the cave, which made this all worse. That thing, whatever it was living there, and it was storing its spare carcasses there. I just kept running towards the house, and I decided that I would forget that this thing ever existed. I never mentioned it to my grandma, and unfortunately she passed away that same year. The estate was sold, so I have no way of going back to see if that thing was still there. And I never got the chance to go back with a camera or anything. I really do not know what I saw, but it looked like some kind of feral human-like monster. It wasn't quite large enough, though. It almost looked childlike. It was small enough to live in that cave. It was nimble enough to climb and stand in the trees as it growled at me. It was seriously creepy as hell, and I hope that I never see anything like it again. And to be honest, I hope that whoever now owns that property never runs into that thing. When I was a kid, and through pretty much all of my time growing up, I used to live near a military base. My dad was in the military, and he was important, I guess. I honestly have not the slightest idea what it was that he actually did, but he was pretty much never home, and I had practically no relationship with him up until the day that he died of cancer. My dad isn't the important part of this, but I think that the military base may be. I can't prove that this thing had anything to do with the military, but would it really surprise anyone if they were out there doing some sort of experiments on humans and mixing them with animals? I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, and I guess I should probably go through the entire event that happened before I say that. I'm not going to say when exactly this was, nor where, but I will say that I was in my early teens, probably 13 at most. We were living in our small 2-bedroom house near the base, and really there was nothing special about it, other than it had a basement that could have doubled as a bomb shelter. The night that this happened, I was in my bed and struggling to fall asleep. I remember vividly that I was having a lot of problems sleeping around this time because I was feeling like something was watching me in my room. I wasn't a paranoid kid, but for a few nights I was feeling like I was paranoid. It was like I was having major anxiety but didn't know why. It didn't happen for very long, but it was something that I was dealing with for a couple of days prior to the actual event. On the night that I saw this thing, I was still having trouble sleeping, and I had pretty much given up on it. So I was sitting on my bed and reading something. While I was reading, I started hearing what sounded like raspy and deep breathing, like someone was struggling to get enough air. It's a hard sound to explain, beyond just deep gasping. The sound wasn't coming from my room, though. It was definitely coming from outside, but it was loud enough that I could very clearly hear what it was. I went over to the window to see what was going on, but at first I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness of night. I kept focusing, trying to adjust my eyes to the dark, and it was then that I saw the thing that was struggling to breathe. It was a man, or what looked like a man, but he was covered in what appeared to be really mangy fur. It almost looked like he should have been covered in fur, but someone took an electric razor and shaved close to 70% of the hair off his body. I couldn't see him at first because he was struggling to stand up from under my window. He was basically sitting there and trying to crawl away, while also trying to pull himself up to his feet. It was at this point that I realized that the sound of the gasping was definitely outlined in pain. This human-like thing was suffering, struggling to breathe, and part of me assumed that it was dying. It made me think that I needed to do something about it. Because I was still a kid, I decided that I needed to tell my mother. I went and woke her up, and I told her that there was a man outside my window that was choking. That was the only way that I could think to explain it to her. She told me to stay in her room and not come out until she came back, and she walked out. I could then hear her get on the phone, and I heard her say my dad's name, and then tell whoever she was talking to which unit we were in. I wasn't sure who she was talking to, but I kind of assumed it was the police. After a few moments of waiting and listening to her talk, I actually left her room and went back to mine, because I was genuinely curious what exactly was going on. I remember hearing my mom and then my dad talking, though they were talking in hushed tones, and I couldn't quite make out what they were actually saying. I could still hear the gasping and choking sound that this humanoid thing was making, but it was quickly cut out by the sound of a large truck pulling up into our yard, which was followed with what sounded like other military men shouting that they were there to help. As they approached, I started hearing the gasping getting louder and faster, almost like this thing was scared of the people that were approaching him. As soon as I started hearing this, I heard my mom and dad talking again and getting louder, which meant that they were coming upstairs. So I ran out of my room and into the hallway. My mother was obviously mad at me for leaving her room, but I just told her that I had to go to the bathroom and she let it alone. I asked them what that was all about, and my dad just told me that it was a homeless man that was very sick, and that they were taking him to the hospital. The fact that my dad was home told me that this was more serious than just a sick homeless guy, but I wasn't going to poke him and ask for more information. That was the only time that anything like this ever happened, and my dad never told me any more info, nor has my mother. I don't know what this thing was, but I can tell you that it wasn't quite human. Or if it was human, it was not fully human. I saw this thing. Something was sincerely wrong with it, or him, or whatever. I don't know if this would qualify as a cryptid really, but to me it was a creature that was unexplainable, which fits technically. Whatever it was, I could tell you that the military took care of it, and that was that. I have a story that happened just a couple of days ago, on January 20th at around 2 to 3 a.m. I just want to write it to see if anyone has seen anything similar. So, me and my boyfriend went to park at a parking lot right by a church. We were in his Jeep facing the church, and he was telling me his past life story, and I was listening to him talk because it was something heavy that was on his chest that he felt he needed to let out to me. He works night shift and was on break, so he gets a call to come back to work at 3. So we're pulling out of the parking lot, and we notice 3 deer. And there was an alleyway that went toward the direction to where you can get a good glance at them. My boyfriend asked me if we should pull in to see the deer, so I said yes, and we did. We parked there for a minute straight staring at these deer, and 2 of them were male, and 1 was female. But it kept walking while the other 2 male deer stopped and stared. We just looked at them, and it was cool, and then we backed out with the headlights facing towards the 3rd deer standing there. And we stopped, and my boyfriend stared at it and said, "That's an ugly, weird-looking deer." I looked, and it did not look normal at all. It stared back at us, but the stare looked so eerie. This deer had a white face from the bottom to its eyes, and its nose was pushed downward like a flat face. The eyes were facing directly straight toward us, and not sideways as a normal deer's would have. The body was that of a deer, and my boyfriend continued to stare and examine this thing, and I was questioning, like, is that a deer or a different animal? And he's like, "No, that's a deer." I stared at it and told my boyfriend, "Why are we just staring at it?" And I looked away because I didn't want to stare at it anymore. I told him to go, and we left. I was just like, that deer did not look normal. And he was like, "You saw that too, right?" I had the chills all the way back home. He told me to not tell anyone what we saw, and tried to convince me that we had only seen the 2 male deers and not the 3rd one to help me feel not as scared, considering I was going home alone. I got home safe and went right to sleep. The next morning, me and my boyfriend talked about it and agreed what we both saw, and then stopped talking about it because I can still see how it looked in my mind. But that's my story. It's just been on my mind because I've never seen anything like that in my life. We are next to a reservation where we were, and I'm not sure if this is relevant, but maybe 30 minutes before we left, there were coyotes in the field whining, and we rolled our windows down to listen to them, and they stopped, so we had just continued talking. Howdy, friends. How are y'all doing? How's it going on this... Oh, it's Friday. How's it going today, guys? Hopefully well. And this, that was a weird way to start this. I guess I should talk about the video before I start going into the personal conversation. That was a collection of cryptid and, I guess, feral human stories. I know some of you asked for feral human stories, and, well, these were definitely in that ballpark, at least some of them. Yeah. Creepy creature, critter thing that we see in the woods or elsewhere. Definitely terrifying. Definitely some scary stuff out there that I don't have a name for, other than, I guess, cryptids. As the definition of a cryptid is an undefined creature, I suppose. I don't know. Weird, creepy stuff. Yeah. Hopefully you all enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button. It helps a lot. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, consider subscribing for more content like this, and content that's nothing like this. You can also leave me a comment letting me know your thoughts, anything you want to hear on the videos, stuff like that, how you're doing, how your day is going, what your weekend plans are. I'd love to read it. I'm getting back into the rhythm of responding to comments again. I know I kind of fell off there. It's a mental thing that I don't want to get into. It's just hard to keep up with stuff whenever there's, like, getting sick, losing your voice, and a lot of stuff affects me mentally whenever this is my job, and I love doing it, and I can't do it, and I don't know. It's hard to explain. But I'm here, and I love you, and, you know, all that stuff. Yeah. You can also do super thanks, which is directly supporting of the channel. Goes directly to my YouTube payments whenever they happen. You can also join the memberships where you get early access to content if I get them out early. Terrible at it, I admit. Patreon, I am much better at because it's just easier to do. It's more direct and it doesn't require a lot of work. So I'm really good at selling my memberships, aren't I? Oh jeez. Anyways, you know what? Let's wrap this up. Hope you're all having a beautiful day. I hope you guys have a gorgeous weekend. I hope everything goes swimmingly for you. And I hope that I see you again on the next video. But until then, friends, remember, you're loved, you're valid, you're important. Never let anyone tell you otherwise, and please, never forget it. And until next time, much love, and sleep well.